Hey guys, it's that one Bronze, and hey, what do you know, looks like I'm not dead after all. So, a while back ago, I essentially made an intro video that said that the only two games I'd probably be doing on the channel was League and Smash. After stumbling upon this game and putting about 420 hours into it, no joke, I've come to realize that this game is sort of like a combination of both League and fighting games in general. If you couldn't really tell from the upload yesterday, as well as what's on screen right now, that game is indeed Battlerite. I feel like including this game on my channel wouldn't be too much of a stretch, seeing how I'm kinda using Smash and League together, and this is just sort of like a combination of both if you think about it. And finally, after putting so much time into it, I really feel comfortable uploading this to my channel now that I have proper game knowledge. But before we get into the video, a quick disclaimer. By no means necessary is anything I say in this video the gospel truth. There's plenty of players that I know personally that have differing opinions. However, that's not to say I'm not going to back my points with evidence. I'm just going to try my best to explain to you why I feel the way about some of these characters, why I feel like they're so strong or so weak in the current meta. I will say, I personally feel like every character in this game is tournament viable. There are obviously characters that are stronger than others, given the situation that they're put in. However, every character has their own little tricks of the trade that helps them progress through the current meta. I'll start from the bottom of the list and gradually go up as I explain each character. But anyways, without any further ado, let's get started. Okay, to start us off on the list, we have Thorn, and Thorn's gonna be one for controversy. Then again, honestly, any character I put at the bottom of the list is going to cause some sort of controversy. Once again, I feel like all the characters in the game are viable. Believe it or not, I really didn't want to put Thorn at the bottom of the list. I was really tempted to put Bakos. However, after sitting down and taking time to really analyze the character, I came to the conclusion that the bottom tier has to be Thorn, sitting in C tier, and the only character that will be sitting in C tier. We'll go ahead and start off with his positives. Thorn is a very zone control heavy character, and he's good at what he does. Possessing probably one of the best orb control abilities in the game, that being his Q, he never really has to put himself in danger for objective control or engage. His E is another one of his very strong abilities, being able to take someone completely out of the fight. And hey, while we're talking about spatial control, it's important to mention his ult. Thorn's ult isn't initially threatening like Ashka's ult, however, it creates this sort of no-go zone for people. It does a lot of damage over time if you stand in it. And Thorn's kit really complements that of his ult, being able to keep people in his ult. Not to mention, it creates a gigantic projectile wall, which completely cancels out projectiles shot in it and at it. With all those abilities, in tandem with his right click and shift right click, it really makes Thorn the best character in the neutral, for the melee category at least. Another tool at his disposal worth mentioning is his R. His R isn't really in the same vein of spatial control, however, it can really discourage an opponent from jumping on someone. Now we're going to dive into what I believe puts Thorn at the bottom of this list. Thorn may have the best neutral in the game, however, once he engages and the fight starts, he isn't really all that much. His damage is extremely lackluster. His autos all don't do too much damage, not to mention they're surprisingly slow. His main redeeming factor about his autos is the pull at the end, and the right that you can get that kind of reduces damage. But even with the right, in order to get the damage reduction, that requires you to sit there and auto them for a while, which really won't happen seeing how slow they are. His severe lack of mobility and cooldown that you really need to keep track of is really what puts a damper on this character. The shield you get from hitting people with your space might encourage you to go in, but honestly that's always a mistake. While you have to face a hefty 8-second cooldown, the only option you have to avoid getting bursted is your R. Not to mention, your R also has a hefty cooldown as well as uses a bar, which ends up taking away from the damage you can do from your shift right click and the potential your ult could have in the fight. While Thorn does have a little bit of healing on his right click, it's not too noticeable, and honestly, you're probably still going to want to support if you're going to play this character to his peak. Against any of the other melees, you're probably not going to win a 1v1, with the only exception probably being Bakos. In summary, I feel like this character is the absolute best character you can pick in the melee category for the neutral, however, it's probably the worst for the actual engage. So if I had to make a recommendation for a comp to play him on, something very passive. His zone control also complements the passive playstyle very well. For example, something like Jade would do really good with Thorn because he's able to peel for her really well. On top of that, Jade can really capitalize off of Thorn's wins in the neutral. However, his low flexibility, being forced to play passive, really makes him a really odd choice for a melee character. However, that's the reason why I have to put him at the bottom of this list. So starting off B tier, we have Bakos, and this is actually one of my favorite champions to play. As with Thorn, we'll talk about his strengths first and his weaknesses second. To address the elephant in the room, Bakos is one of the only characters in the game with a Reflect. The initial idea of having the Reflect in general makes it very, very scary for the opponent to go all in. Whether you use your Reflect or not can really dictate how the neutral and the engage goes. Bakos is a very, very powerful all-in character. With the right reads and execution, Bakos can easily take someone from full health to half or even death. Bakos' right click is a very, very powerful tool of his, giving him a very threatening ranged option in the neutral and while chasing. While doing massive damage on its own, you can get Battlerites that heal you and snare the opponent. Bakos' space is a nice gap closer as well. The AoE on the move makes it very difficult to walk out of, so more often than not, it'll force a defensive option from the opponent. It's also worth mentioning that Bakos has a right that provides 33 damage reduction whenever you space in. On top of it all, Shift Space provides an end cap, which allows you to be very pick and choosy about who you want to engage on. Now, Bakos' E and Shift E are very important pieces of his combo. Ramming an opponent into the wall does more damage and provides a stun, which allows you to further follow up on your combo. On top of that, E and Shift E are very good at repositioning the orb to get it right where you want it to be. His R works extremely well with engage heavy comps. Providing a massive shield to all your allies in the area, this move will make sure you win almost any trade. Bakos' ult is an extremely big game changer, going through counters and doing massive damage in a giant AoE, and stunning if you hit someone against the wall. Use it after an opponent has used their jumps and you are guaranteed to do massive damage. Overall, Bakos' engage is absolutely devastating. His mobility isn't that bad either, especially if you take the rights on his Q, giving you an extra dash and 60% mobility while your shield's up. Now, in hindsight, that sounds like an amazing character. It sounds borderline broken if you think about it. However, Bakos has one devastating flaw which prevents him from being tiers up. Bakos has absolutely no self-sustain. It is required to have a support on this character. And sadly, it's that really low flexibility that kinda hinders this character. In 2s, it can prove very difficult to be able to use this character effectively, seeing how most of the supports are ranged. With Bakos being a very heavy all-in character, it can prove very difficult to deal with ranged supports in general, seeing how you don't get the most out of his kit. So overall, Bakos is a very, very strong character when used in the right circumstances. Bakos' presence provides a very, very strong threat to the enemy team, and that's what makes the character so strong. However, his all-in playstyle and need of a support makes it very difficult to find a position where you can effectively play Bakos. On the bright side of all this though, the new character Uldren seems very, very strong with Bakos from what I've seen so far, and hopefully I'll be able to see more of that in future games to come. So if I were to recommend a team comp that you would play Bakos on in 2s or 3s, I would heavily recommend looking to have an Uldren on your team, or Sirius. Those two are very heavy engaged supports, so it very heavily complements Bakos' playstyle. But anyways, that's enough about Bakos. On to the next one on our list. Up next, also in B tier, we have Regan. One of Regan's main strengths is his second ability, Curse. Being able to put it on with a charged auto or your space, it makes it very, very easy to get it off on your opponents during a fight. The self-sustain provided on Curse makes it very, very difficult to 1v1 this character. But where this character strives the most is his sticking power. Starting off talking about Regan's space, one of his most valuable tools, it provides Regan with intangibility and puts Curse on targets. Not to mention, you can also get a Battlerite, which gives you another charger space. Regan's E pulls the enemy towards you and roots them with the correct Battlerites. Regan's Shift E can even pull allies out from a sticky situation and heal them. If your jumps are on cooldown, you can always get out with R. However, I don't recommend engaging with it, seeing how the initial hit is very difficult to land due to the long startup. Regan also has a very heavy damage projectile. Although it is slow and you probably won't get it off in a fight very often, it is there, and you can use it in the neutral. What really makes this character shine though is his ultimate ability. While maintaining full control of Regan, your autos do heavy damage now, have extreme lifesteal, and you have a pull that's on extremely low cooldown and also does heavy damage. If there's no way to crowd control Regan while he's ulting, the battle is most likely turned into Regan's favor. While great self-sustain and heavy sticking power are great aspects of a character, Rakan isn't without his flaws. Honestly, Rakan's main flaw is the meta that we currently possess. If you're unaware, burst team comps are very strong in Battlerite as of right now. Rakan's sustain damage doesn't really do all too much for him, and he can't quite burst someone as well as most other characters can. Sure, his healing is great, it's amazing actually, but it's not going to do too much if they chunk you for true damage before you can do anything. Same applies for when he's dishing out damage. Sure, you can do a whole bunch of damage if you stick on someone. However, chances are the healer can just burst heal it back and you'll just get bursted back and pay for it. You'll lose the trade. I feel like Rakan works really well with team comps that could really use his peel, or in the very least, use the attention that Rakan gets and capitalize off of it. Using Taya for example, I feel like she would do very well with Rakan. If I can take the focus, or in the very least, peel for Taya, Taya can do a ton of damage while Rakan is frontlining. And now, with Rakan out of the way, let's move on to our final B tier character. Rounding up the end of B tier, we have Jamila. Jamila is a very mobile, high damage CC melee character. Her auto string is probably one of the best melee auto strings in the game. 2 full auto combos do roughly 60, and if you couldn't tell, that's a lot. Her right click is a meh projectile. It's not really all too threatening, however you can get a right that heals on it, but outside of that it's nothing really too notable. It does, however, have a nice bounce that it can do in crowds, which makes it really nice for orb control, but overall it's just a move that you can spam in neutral. Jamila's space is a very powerful tool. Once bouncing off the wall, you can bounce back and in-cap anyone in your path. Not to mention, it has a large amount of iframes, and if you're afraid someone's going to counter, you can always either aim the opposite way, or you can even cancel on the wall. Jamila's Q is her blade counter, which provides a bit of fear into going all in on Jamila. Once the counter is hit, Jamila turns invisible, gains a little bit of iframes, and a small heal to help. After that, Jamila's next auto puts a decent burst timer, much in the same way of Croak's ult, on the opponent. It does a decent chunk of damage too, so it's pretty threatening. Jamila's E is a bit of a loopy move, to be honest with you. Not only does it pull you to whatever you hit, it also, oddly enough, cancels the channel of most attacks. Her R is an extremely strong tool of hers, not only giving her a nice AoE stun, but also doing a nice chunk of damage which allows her to follow up for even more. Honestly, Jamila's shift abilities aren't too much to gawk about, however her shift space can be pretty useful at times, as it allows you to act like you're bouncing off a wall without a wall. So on more open maps, it could prove to be pretty useful. Overall, Jamila has some of the most devastating sustained damage in the entire game. However, she does have some minor flaws that really hold her back. Much like Bakos, she doesn't have a real way to heal herself effectively. Yeah, she has right click, and just like Bakos, it's not really too noticeable. I also feel like Jamila really struggles with people kiting her in the game. Outside of her E, she doesn't really have a good approach to approach people with. Sure, you could say her space is a gap closer, but the cast time makes it really unreasonable to hit with. Anyone who sees you getting ready to space is most likely ready to get out of the way. Her counter is a decent engage, giving her haste and making her invisible. However, like most invisibilities, you see an eye over your head, so you know when to jump away from Jamila. Not to mention, expecting your approach to be reliant on a counter is really inconsistent. Also, her ult, while extremely flashy, isn't exactly the best. It's extremely easy to play around. If they still have a jump, they could very easily get out that way, or if they have a counter of some sort, that's another way that they could very easily get out of it. In the current match being shown, Rakan even Q'd and it just so happened to snare it and he got out of it. So that just seemed very unfortunate. There's just way too much to counterplay with her ult for it to be very reliable. Most of the time, you're better off just using her R. So if I were to recommend Jamila to a specific team comp, I feel like she works very well with engaged team comps. If by any chance your teammate can get them to blow some cooldowns, you're free to just wail on them with your autos, you can do some insane damage and even turn the tides of the battle sometimes with how much damage you do just sitting there wailing on them or stunning them. It's insane. I feel like Aldrin or Sirius would be very nice to have on your team, as they are both able to easily blow the enemy's cooldowns. Sirius specifically, no one really wants to get hit with that charged auto, so I'm sure they're either going to counter or jump away. It's very devastating, so off of that, Jamila can just capitalize to the fullest. And with that being said, that just about wraps up B tier for melees. As a footnote, I feel like each of the characters that I talk about in each of the tiers have identical power, or they're at least very, very close in power. Just because I talked about Bakos first doesn't mean I think he's worse than Jamila, vice versa. The same will be applied to A tier. However, I have A plus tier and an S tier for two separate characters that I feel like are just a league above the A characters. Without any further ado, let's get on with it. Alright, so kicking off A tier, we have my own personal main, Rook. Rook is the very definition of an extremely versatile champion. Having so many tools at his disposal, Rook can really be formed to any situation needed. Let's go ahead and get started in looking into one of his most overlooked abilities, Armor Break. Rook has two reliable ways to put Armor Break onto his opponents. Both his right click and his E are very, very useful at applying Armor Break onto people. The AoE on these moves makes it possible for you to land Armor Break on multiple people, which can, most of the time, win you team fights. Armor Break is most notoriously useful for increasing your damage output. However, if you take the correct rights, you can also decrease their damage output. Moving on to his right click, it is one of the two ways that you can put Armor Break on your opponent, however it has a lot of other uses as well. Right click, aside from counter invincibility, is the only sort of iframe that Rook really has. Because of this, it's very, very important for a Rook player to know when to use his right click correctly. It's also very commonly accepted to take the stun Battlerite on his right click. The stun on his right click provides Rook with a reliable way to cancel channels like on ults. However, another use for it is it could be used for extra peel for your teammate if they're playing someone ranged. Although, I wouldn't really recommend it in a 1v1 situation. If the opponent has anything that goes through counters, such as a difficult to dodge AoE or an ult, it can prove bad news for you if you use your right click. Rook's lack of a true escape is what makes his right click so important for dodging things. While he may struggle to escape most of the time, he has some of the best engage with his space. If not blocked by an opponent, Rook has probably the longest reaching space in the game. Rook's space is a very, very useful engage, stunning whoever he comes into contact with, as well as increasing damage for distance travel. Assuming you take the correct right where he gets berserk whenever he lands space, it's very easy for Rook to stay on people and just keep wailing on them, doing massive amounts of damage in the process. However, once Rook's in, the real question is, when is he going to use his Q? A Rook that uses his Q too often and is easily predicted is most likely a bad Rook or a dead Rook, in worst cases. Providing momentary invincibility as well as a massive increase in attack speed, it's very important that you learn when to use your Q so that you get it off most often. His Q is also a very versatile move. Using the move whenever you expect to be knocked away or someone attempts to outtrade you, if you're able to land it, you more often than not outtrade them. You can also use your Q when you're in a sticky situation, as the movement speed granted from it can allow you to get out, as well as the invincibility preventing you from taking too much damage. Moving on to his E is probably my favorite projectile in the game. It might not do the most damage like say a Regan right click or a Bakos right click. However, being the large AoE that it is, it's nearly impossible to walk out of sometimes unless the opponent wants to waste a defensive option to avoid getting hit. The pushback on the move also is very, very good for space control. It's important to mention that also if you take the right on the E that puts Armor Break on his E as well as 2 extra damage, your opponent can feel a little bit more threatened to get hit by that E, which might make them waste defensive options more often than not. Maybe not use the E when the opponent is the entirety of the map away and they can only be pushed back, simply because what makes the E scary isn't quite the 18 damage or the ability that it's hard to dodge, it's really what happens after you get hit with the E that's scary. Rook's R isn't a crazy amount to talk about, however, that's not to say it isn't extremely useful. It functions as many incapacitates do. It allows you to focus on one target while the other one is currently unable to do anything, or it can provide a pretty decent combo for Rook to follow up on. However, in a 1v1 situation, it's also very useful as Rook can get his shift left click off and he can heal up. Rook's shift left click is an extremely powerful tool of his. Shift left click gives Rook an insane amount of healing. A first initial heal and then a little bit of heal over time. Rook is very, very powerful as an engage, as a tank, all because of this move. Rook's shift right click, it may be a decent projectile and provide a pretty good snare, but however I wouldn't often use a bar for it. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about Rook's ult. Certainly not the best ult, but however in very open maps or team fights per se, it can be very, very useful as you can get a lot of damage off of it. Getting all 3 hits off roughly does 90 damage. Not to mention, for the most part, Rook is invincible during it, however he still can get stunned out of it when he is on the ground. Rook's main flaw is that he really doesn't have a way to get out once he's in. If he's in to stay. This isn't a problem if you're consistently landing your counters, however, if you blow your counter and you're in, you're most likely going to get exploded. Because of Rook's extreme versatility, he can really be played on any sort of team. However, if there is a preference, an Uldren would be really, really nice. I won't go into too much detail about my main, seeing how I could go hours and hours just ranting about Rook. However, maybe one day in the future I might drop a Rook guide. Alright, so next up in A tier we have Regan, and this character I really think fits nice and cozy in the A tier. Regan, I believe, has everything you could want in a melee character's kit, one of his most important being his right click. Regan's right click gives him a good amount of almost everything. Being a dash, it does provide very good movement, however the damage and the sustain off of it is definitely nothing to laugh at either. Not to mention, his autos reduce the cooldown of his right click and also empower it. This by itself makes Regan really difficult to peel. It gives him a crazy amount of sustain and gap closes in his natural combo. His space is also another very powerful tool. Landing in space does a decent chunk of damage, not to mention it goes fairly far for most melees. However, it is important to note that if you're not including rights, his space is his only true iframe, so you have to be cautious. Regan's Q is essentially Bakos' Q on steroids. One of the more obvious benefits of his parry over Bakos' shield is the fact that it's all around him. However, unlike Bakos, you do sort of have to aim where you want to parry your projectile towards. While this may sound more intimidating for people just picking up the game, this can prove more beneficial as you can direct projectiles to hit more vulnerable targets. It's also important to note that you can get a right that gives a small burst of healing after your parry ends. Now, Regan's E is a very essential part of his kit, and it's also very important that you take the gap closing Battlerite on it. With said Battlerite, once you land your E, you instantly have a way to get in on the opponent without having to waste your space. If you do land his E, you can either use his space to get out of an unfavorable situation, or use your space to follow up on a vulnerable target. Now, Regan's R is a very interesting tool in his kit. It allows for really good zone control, and also complements his combo very well. If you take the Battlerite on his R that allows you to recast his R if you land it, you're also able to make a new makeshift combo for Regan. R left click R can put your opponent in a very unfavorable position. Regan's shift abilities are very interesting, if I'm being perfectly honest. Regan's shift left click puts a projectile on the end of his autos, which give him a little bit of health if he lands them. In a 1v1 scenario, Regan can seem a lot more threatening if he has his shift left click on. Regan's Shift E is probably one of the more reliable and useful incapacitates in the game. Not only being in a gap close with it, but being able to call it out easier if you're in a voice channel with a teammate also makes it very, very useful. With a lot of other incapacitates, I find my teammates often hitting them more often than not as I incapacitate them. So having a little extra time to call it out definitely makes it useful. Also, something to note is that the air time is also stacked on top of the incapacitate time, so it can take someone out of a fight for a really, really long time. Now, Regan's ult has the potential to be a very big game changer. If Regan hits the initial dash on his ult, he spawns a massive AoE dot that can really hurt an opponent with their mobility skills on cooldown. This is really good for area control and sometimes orb control if the opponent's long-range orb control projectiles are down. Now, going on to Regan's flaws, he really doesn't have that much. He's kind of a jack of all trades. The only reason he's not any higher on this list is just because the other characters just seem to do his job just a little bit better. If I had to think of any sort of flaw of his, it really would have to be the fact that he only has one true iframe. His E isn't really reliable since it's so slow and, predictable. In summary, I think that Regan is a very strong melee champion, with all the tools that make a melee character great. He has a really low skill floor, so he's very easy for people to pick up and see success with. However, he also has a very high skill cap with his Q and mobility, so you can always keep getting better with the character. As far as teams go, I feel like he's very flexible, and honestly goes good with most any comp, so just play whoever you feel most comfortable with. Lastly, but certainly not least in A tier, we have Croak, and this one I'm sure is going to get some controversy. Don't get me wrong, Croak is very powerful, and played correctly, he's one of the most scary characters in the entire game. But despite his tremendous abilities, he does have flaws that most melees don't. Getting started with his positives though, it's necessary to talk about his autos as they function differently from any other characters in the game besides maybe Jade or Eva, but even those are a stretch. Croak's autos do 8 damage each. While being less than the average auto damage, he attacks insanely fast for the first few autos, which can be refreshed by his other abilities being his Q, space, and R, but also can be recharged given enough time in between autos. This makes Croak a very burst heavy character, and generally you want to build rights around it. Croak's right click though isn't really too much to feel threatened by. It does very little damage that's easily healed, and even with the right that increases the healing gain from his right click, it usually ends up feeling like it's doing next to nothing. Croak's space makes him extremely mobile. Being able to recast it without having to waste a right on it is always a very powerful tool, giving him the ability to either further chase or safely retreat. The fact that it recharges your autos as well as doing a threatening amount of damage on landing can make Croak's jumps very intimidating. Croak's Q is a stealth that recharges his autos and causes his next auto to stun for a good amount of time, allowing you to get a good burst off. The right that puts a burst dot on the opponent also helps with Croak's ability to do true damage to an opponent who is caught out by the stun. It can also be a pretty interesting bait to scare your opponent by getting close and causing them to waste some defensive options. If that defensive option happens to be a counter, then you can even further capitalize off it. This creates an interesting interaction between you and your opponent, where you can condition them to either be more cautious with their counter by waiting it, or you can potentially make them waste it early more often by stunning them as soon as possible. Croak's E is a nifty tool that complements his mobility and can be used in a variety of different ways, especially with the rights that complement your playstyle. Seeing how it doesn't trigger counters, it's generally safe to use in combos, in which case you would take the Battlerite that causes a root so you can lock down your opponent for the team. Unlike most other dashes in the game, he's not stopped or hindered in any way if he comes into contact with an opponent either. With this in mind, you can go all in with both your spaces while having an escape, made most reliably of a strategy if you take the extra range Battlerite on his E. Croak's R is his main way of sustaining damage and somewhat avoiding getting out-sustained himself. His R recharges his weapons with 2 extra charges on top of the base charges, and places a small dot that his left click gives on his auto. This is a nice tool for dueling, but it's primarily useful in order to keep his damage output high. Croak's shift abilities are very strong, and more often than not, you should probably be using your bars on your shift abilities rather than your ultimate. Croak's shift left click makes his left click a skill shot that now puts a blind on the target. Whereas this isn't too threatening by itself, it makes Croak very difficult to peel, and ranged characters can find it really difficult to do much. Croak can openly get his burst off without having too much pressure getting crowd controlled. Croak's shift Q actually works very similarly in functionality to his shift left click. The main differences being though, while his shift left click is range and only blinds, his shift Q is melee and literally makes it so the opponent cannot do anything because, well, it's an end cap. Generally speaking though, you want to be using your shift Q a lot because you're still invisible and get the stun after hitting someone with the end cap, so you can still burst someone uncontested in 2v2s or relieve pressure in 3v3s. Croak's ult really isn't anything too crazy. Sure, it does a decent chunk of damage and the AoE definitely makes the enemy team split up. However, it's not really worth much in the long run, seeing how his EX abilities can really get more out of a round than, say, 1 or 2 ults. His ult doesn't really guarantee damage either, seeing how the long detonation time can give the opponent plenty of time to get their iframes off cooldown. Now let's get started on the negatives. It's important to note that while he is a melee character, Croak isn't too much of a frontline. Overall, his game plan is to bob in and out while his abilities come off cooldown, so he's not going to be tanking for any kind of team comp. This makes it very difficult for him to peel enemies off of his teammates, as he usually has to use a bar to end cap someone. Croak's teammates, because of this, are pretty susceptible to getting ran down, so he needs someone on his team who can't really easily be ran down. Croak also lacks a good form of sustain. His sustain exists, but it isn't too threatening or noticeable unless you want to use 2 rights for it. In short, Croak can be a very powerful asset to have on a team. His insane burst can snowball a game, and if played right, he's very difficult to deal with. But his glass cannon archetype proves to be his main weakness. If I were to recommend a team he would be played well on, I would say a support who can peel for themselves fairly easily, as well as can complement Croak's frequent in and out playstyle. Something like an Tsundere would have a lot of benefit to Croak. Now, the only character in A+ tier I have is Freya. Now, you might be asking yourself, why didn't I put her in A tier and why didn't I put her in S tier with the other character? However, I think that Freya is better than the characters in A tier, however, not nearly as good as the character I have put in S tier, so she gets this nice little cozy spot in A+. Freya is everything and more you could want in a melee character, and her kit immediately makes that apparent. I won't hint too much on her autos as they function similar to most, but it's worth noting that her autos and some of her moves are empowered by static, and every third auto in a string does area damage, which is very effective in teamfights. Freya's right click is a very important tool in her kit, as a decent damage projectile as well as an end cap if you knock an opponent with static against the wall, not to mention it's very easy and safe to land the end cap. The projectiles themselves also apply static, and comes with a right that gives you an additional charge, so double tapping an opponent against the wall to end cap them is very possible. Freya's space is an iframe that gives her haste as well as empowers her next auto, even more so with rights that complement it. The hop, as well as the haste after, makes Freya's chase game insane, enough so to be able to chase down an opponent who uses an escape option with the haste alone. Freya's Q can change games by itself at times, especially with the right that pulls in nearby enemies. By itself, it pulls in whoever hits the counter and grants her a large amount of shield to win any trade after. The counter can be hit multiple times, pulling in and applying static to additional targets, and for every time the counter is hit, it applies another level of ridiculousness to her shields. Freya's E is an iframe that puts static in a small AoE around her, and depending on the rights you take, it can also grant a shield for each person hit as well as pull them in. It's always a nice tool to have, being used for end cap setups or simply the iframe, or even just to gain a little extra sustain in a fight. It's a great move in Freya's arsenal. Freya's art is a downright ridiculous move, in combination with the Battlerite for it at least. Essentially costing absolutely nothing, hitting an AoE in front of her, and granting a huge amount of shield for each enemy hit. This is one of the many reasons people find Freya to be unkillable. The only downfall of the move is you absolutely have to have the right for it, but with it, you can freely spam the move on cooldown as long as you hit it, which isn't difficult. Freya's shift abilities are okay and all, but her ult is where most of your bars are going to go, so I won't spend too much time talking about it. Freya's shift space is essentially her space on steroids, putting a snare and static on the first opponent that you auto with no right required. Meanwhile, her shift E does light damage and applies a fading snare in a line in front of her as well as applies static, so it's really good in teamfights overall. Freya's ult, even by itself, is pretty ridiculous, coming out relatively quickly, having a large AoE, doing insane damage, and the fact that Freya is intangible during the channel makes it extremely powerful. However, on top of all of that, Freya can true combo into her ult off of her own end cap. This combo guarantees a crazy amount of damage and sometimes even a kill. It can really win games. As far as weaknesses though, none really stand out on Freya. The only thing I can really think of is the fact that she has no way to really heal herself, but the ability to constantly shield herself makes it not as important as it is on other melees. Team comp wise, Freya can carry almost anything, however she does best with other rushdown suited supports like Aldrin or Sirius. Finally, our coup de grace of the melee characters, sitting as the only character in S tier, we have Shifu, and I feel like it's very easy to see where I'm coming from. Wasting no time getting into it, Shifu's right click is an AoE in a line straight in front of him that does more damage based on how many stacks of autos he has. This, while doing less damage to each new target hit, pierces enemies. Doing this in a crowd can be devastating, and it makes it very difficult to contest Shifu's orb control. This also gives Shifu an extremely reliable burst built right into his combo. It also moves him forward very slightly, so that sort of helps with his chase. Shifu's space is probably the single best space in the game, as it makes Shifu very difficult to punish. He's immaterial for quite a long duration, and he's free to do anything he pleases. It's very obvious that this gives Shifu a gigantic advantage over his competition, as he can utilize this to be unpunishable or even burst an opponent down with no way of stopping him. He's granted haste while he's in space, so even if you jump away, you're not really stopping him. Shifu's Q is a gap closing counter similar to Freya's. However, instead of granting a shield and pulling the opponents in, he teleports behind you, gaining a stack with the correct rights, and also empowering his next auto immensely. On top of all of that, he's also granted brief immaterial and teleports behind you, not even saying nothing personal kid before doing so much damage that's essentially true with only one auto and a right click. Shifu's E is a projectile gap closer with a short hop. Very similar to Regan's E, but is casted almost instantly, can hit walls to still give the gap closer, and also comes with 2 charges. This, in combination with his space and Q, is what defines Shifu as being unpeelable and unpunishable, all while he's doing massive damage. Shifu's R is a nice and quick end cap that allows him to either peel for himself or allies, allowing him to be very selective with who he wants to go on. Probably one of the best parts about this move is the fact that you can go right, which refunds over half the energy cost whenever you land it, making it very spammable. Shifu's shift space makes his unpunishable style even more beneficial, as his autos now heal him for an immense amount with each auto landed. With this in mind, you can take his right that gives him more energy for each auto landed while he's in his space, making it so that you can always do your shift space instead of your regular space. Shifu's shift E is very similar to his regular E, however, it pulls the enemy towards him rather than him towards the enemy. This is very useful if you want to put the opponent in a bad position, potentially making them wasting defensive options to get away, which then you can capitalize off of with your second E. Shifu's ult is a game changer and a half. In a massive AoE around Shifu, he spins for about 3 seconds, doing over 100 damage to anyone caught inside for the duration. On top of all of that, he's also granted a shield and haste to stay on top of people. Did I mention that it can also be paired with a space to make it so it's impossible to CC him out of his ult? Finally, Shifu overall is just downright broken. He's receiving slight nerfs to his R cone size damage on the day I'm posting this. However, I don't think that's going to do too much to stop his overall ridiculousness. As you would expect, being the S tier that Shifu is, he doesn't really have any clear weaknesses. Honestly, I can't even think of one area that Shifu could use improvement on. As far as team comps though, anything that can increase Shifu's ability to burst an opponent like Xander or Rook would be very nice for Shifu to have. A very popular team comp in 3s is Xander, Jade, and Shifu. This is popular for many reasons, but Shifu benefits greatly from the extra peel from Xander as well as Arcane Catalyst, while Jade provides heavy pressure for the opponents. Landing a snipe makes Shifu's entire burst do true damage. Also, if Shifu gets his burst off, then Jade's snipe essentially does true damage as well. Alright, well that just about wraps up my tier list. Feel free to discuss and leave your own opinions on characters in the comments below. As of the date of recording, I find this content to be very easy to put out, so I might be uploading more regularly if I post stuff something like this. However, going on to roughly 40 minutes long, you can imagine that my future uploads will be segmented into different categories. As an example, I would have the support tier list where I cover low and mid tier, and then another video where I cover high and top tier. Seeing how Battlerite and my computer get along fine and my current Smash setup is down at the moment, I'll be uploading a lot more Battlerite content. The other classes tier list will indeed come out, but seeing how this ended up being roughly 40 minutes, I plan to segment the tier list into separate videos. As an example, I would like to do a video talking about the low and mid tier with another one discussing the high and top tier. However, tier lists won't be the only thing uploaded Battlerite related. As you can probably see from last week, I uploaded a montage and there will surely be more to come. I also want to touch on more in-depth character analysis and guides, and potentially even game mechanics from Battlerite. With all that in mind, you guys tell me what you think, and hopefully I'll be back uploading soon.